Hi, my name is Audrey Emran Beardsley. I'm a professor at Arizona State University and the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College. I am also the fortunate host of a show that we've created entitled Inside the Academy of Education. Today I'm speaking with and in admiration of Dr. Eva Baker. It is a pleasure to honor you.
Thank you.
The first section of the show, we're going to talk about becoming Eva. So we'll start with, tell us about your family and your childhood.
I was the child of teenagers who lived in New York. My mother lived in a very fancy part of Coney Island called Seagate, depression-proof. Lived with her grandfather, who invented rust-proof paint, and that's how he made his money in World War I guess. And then my father lived nearby. My mother, because of the Regents system, graduated from high school when she was 14 and went to college, went to Brooklyn College, and my father was there. She was married at 16. I was born at 17. Her mother had been remarried, had a child who was a child star, as they would say, in Hollywood. So my mother wanted to move to Los Angeles. Oh. And so I was born in Los Angeles at home with a county doctor coming because my parents had no money. And my mother was essentially seeking to remedy the abandonment that she had felt. So my father, a few years later, near the end of World War II, was declared draftable and sent to Europe. And my mother and I followed him around in the States before he went. And he was in Europe for a couple of years. And then my mother wrote a Dear John letter. And, when he came home, she didn't want to be married anymore. So she was all of 22 at the time, right?
Wow.
And so, one could understand.
Sure.
But for me, it was very traumatic because I was waiting for my daddy to come back, and, that didn't happen. My mother ultimately remarried, and there are 3 kids that came of this marriage. And then my father remarried after I was in college. He said he wasn't going to remarry until I was launched. And so he also has 3. My father decided to finish college and so went to UCLA. And when I was 9 or so, he would take me to UCLA football games, baseball games, whatever. I'm quite a sports person because of his tutelage. And so that's where I developed, I think, my strong association with UCLA and some deep enmity with USC because we went to a football game and the kids were mean to me because I had a UCLA hat on, but we were sitting in an SE section. So I've never lost, this early experience.
School pride.
But my parents were very different. My mother, very, very smart, but needed sort of to live by her wits, didn't go back to school. My father did go to school. My father, very calm and supportive and typical in the sense of fathers of achieving women, in that he thought I could do anything. And so if I said I wanted to draw, then I all of a sudden got colored pencils. And and these were at some cost to him. He didn't have many resources at the time. So all of this went along forever until I was singing, and I'm aware I can't sing at all. And he said, "Oh, you have a beautiful voice." And I thought, is anything he said true all this time? So he was the person who always thought that I was great. Whatever I wanted to do, I could do. Going to college was never a question. My mother, I never could do anything right. I took care of the younger kids and affiliated with them rather than with her. And I'd say, well, look at my report card. And she said, you better not bring home a B. I mean, that was sort of the thing. So both sides were very focused on achievement. And my mother was, I think it was more about performance than, being able to do something I would be able to do in the future.
Where did you go to school?
Well, I went to, if you know how, I lived in Hollywood, so I went to Vine Street School of Hollywood and Vine, and then a junior high nearby, and then Hollywood High School.
And what kind of student were you?
I was a very good student because it was a perfect escape. My father had moved north to Sacramento, so I was kind of on my own in the home that I didn't feel like I really belonged in. And so I did well, but I wasn't the high school girl of my dreams. We didn't have a lot of money, and at that point, Hollywood High was the elite public school. It's where all the kids of screenwriters and directors and so on all lived in the Hollywood Hills. So, there were more cashmere sweaters, over the school. And I remember my dad bought me a cashmere sweater once, and I was so relieved. But now I think about it, it had to be the cheapest kind, short sleeve, crew neck, whatever.
Sure.
But that was the thing. Everybody wore cashmere sweaters, socks to match, pleated skirts. That was it.
Were there things that you learned as a student that inspired who you are today?
In high school?
Or grade school?
Actually not. It was all easy. I mean, it was really easy for me. And I mean, some of it was I didn't want to be noticed. And so I wouldn't raise my hand. I wouldn't sort of put myself forward. So maybe inversely I learned, but not at the time. I didn't feel part of the main group. I still did things, like I ran for office and was elected. So there's a disjunct in what I think I was and what I actually did.
Sure.
But it seemed easy. And, it was always a foregone conclusion I was going to go to college. My father wanted me at Berkeley because I would be closer to him.
Okay.
And I wanted to go to Stanford. And he said, okay, but you'll be the poorest kid at Stanford. And so essentially I got the message he'd prefer me not. So I went to UCLA.
So you went to UCLA. And what was your undergrad major?
Started in Spanish. My teacher was from Cuba. And all my Spanish had been from somebody from Mexico. I realized this was not the major for me when I showed up and there was a test that day and I didn't know because I didn't understand his Spanish very well. Sure. So then I switched to psychology, and my Psych 1A professor was Dick Atkinson, whom you may know ultimately was head of NSF and the president of the UC system, and he was quite, at the time, a young professor, quite beautiful, so all the girls were just swooning at this person. That was a good class. The second class was physiological psychology. It was like a nightmare. I decided, no, I'm not doing that. I will go to be an English major because I was a reader. And in fact, when I was in elementary school, my father would go to school with me every start of the semester and humiliatingly ask the teacher what I was going to learn that year. And she would say, usually a woman, and he would say, no, she already knows that. She already knows that. Don't let her get away with reading things she's already read. So going to the English department at UCLA was great because I'd already read this. So my academic interest at UCLA was, I think I pledged a sorority, which was, a throwback, essentially. And I took classes that were 8 and 9 in the morning so I could get to the beach by 10. My goal in life was to have a very good suntan.
Sounds familiar.
It's kind of pathetic, but there I was.
But you're 18.
Yeah, I was 18.
So then you continued on also at UCLA to get your master's degree?
No, well, wait, I got married when I was 20.
Oh, okay.
And my husband was in the ROTC, had to go away for 6 months. And during that time, the Berlin Wall was built, 1961, 2. And so his orders were held, and we had to stay in the military an extra year. Moved to Colorado, in Colorado Springs, and we're there for a year. And then I came back to finish my senior year.
Okay.
And it was so much easier. I mean, I realized how to be a student at that point.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Sure.
So then I went into the grad program in English as a master's student in American literature, and decided, like everybody else at that time, that I might need a teaching credential, even though I was going to be a writer. So I went to the education school, took a test, which they required you take to get in, and I did well on it, apparently. They called me up and asked me if I wanted to be a reader. And I said, well, I haven't had any of those classes yet. And they said, no problem. So I became a reader. And then because that was, a way for us to make money, we were relatively, poor at that moment. And the person I was reading for was Jim Popham.
Oh.
And he said, you could be a TA and you can make 25 cents more an hour or something. I said, wow, great, sign me up. And he said, no, apparently you have to have a graduate program in education. So I just switched out of English for 25 cents an hour and then went into that program and taught with him in teacher education for a long time, and then worked with Art Lumsdaine, who was a media, computer, instructional design person. And then Lumsdaine left to go to Washington, and then I continued to work with Jim Popham.
And so that continued into your doctorate, your EDD, also at UCLA.
Right. I wanted a PhD. In fact, my father, who's only been supportive in my whole life, when he heard I was switching to education, he never swore, ever. And he used kind of a barnyard word about education. How could you do this to yourself? And I said, well, it feels like it's the right thing. And so he said, okay, I'll support you, whatever you want to do. And so I, worked in this area, and for years never told him anything about what I was doing. He didn't know what my vita was. He didn't know anything. And then once I was testifying before a state education committee, and I went to Sacramento, and he sat in, and he said, oh, I didn't know you did that. And I said, well, I didn't want to tell you. And he said, send me everything. So I sent him a lot. But it was, it was really clear. He thought I should be in math. He thought I might be in medicine. Maybe urban planning would be interesting in a new field. Biochemistry, education, not on the list.
Right. What did you study for your dissertation?
For my dissertation, you're asking interesting questions, aren't you? There was a period of time when Jim Popham was kind of avid about this notion of behavioral objectives. The notion was, if you read curriculum anywhere, it would say to understand X, to be conversant with Y, to, comprehend Z. And he felt that allowed any assessment that had the content in it to be appropriate. What he didn't know he was thinking about was what the cognitive requirements were. didn't come to his mind in that way. But he wanted to operationalize behavior. And, Skinner, Holland, all those people were in the ascendance kind of at that time. So my dissertation was an empirical study of the effects of behavioral objectives on teacher performance as judged by kids' test scores.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yeah.
Throwback.
And now, but it wasn't in the sense of value added or anything like that. It was an experimental study.
Sure.
Some teachers had it, some teachers didn't. The kids got tests that were appropriate to the objectives, but also more general so that it didn't bias the results too much.
A stronger design.
Yeah,
of course.
Study was run in Las Vegas, actually.
Tell us about, you had a stint with the Peace Corps?
Well, let me back up.
Okay.
When I was first married, my goal was to get a degree and then start being a writer, and also to start a family. I had 5 miscarriages and a stillbirth. And while that was happening, I felt like I couldn't get a job at being a teacher. My life was on hold. And so by the time I had a successful pregnancy, I was ready to take my qualifying exams. I had just stayed in school to keep occupied, right? And I was interested in the work and had a good time. I mean,
sure.
But on the personal level, it was waiting for this baby to happen. And so I stayed in bed the whole time for this pregnancy, and Jim Popham, other professors at UCLA made sure I could do coursework and research assistant work and so on. And then, the baby was born. And what did I do? I went immediately back to work, which sort of was a contradiction in my expectations.
Sure.
I thought I was going to stay home, watch the baby nap, and then write novels. That was my goal. But anyway, I stayed in school. She didn't sleep through the night forever, and I was taking my qualifying exams. During that time, it was pretty hard. And then so she was born. I was still in grad school. Got a job at something called the Southwest Regional Laboratory, which was like the Far West Regional Laboratory where David Berliner was, so sort of contemporaries. And then a job opened up at UCLA in the summer of 1968. And I was kind of slipped in because they hired 14 people. They didn't want to hire their own graduates.
Sure.
But I was able to get a job, and I wanted to live close by where my kids, were at home, and school was close by. So that was great.
And then, so what was the Peace Corps involvement?
Sorry, I lost that.
That's okay.
While I was pregnant and at home, we designed a study at the UCLA lab school. I mean, this would never pass an IRB now, but train kids to observe teachers according to things we had taught them in the course that Jim Popham and I worked on, and systematically train them so they could remember what the rating scale was and not have to fill it out while they were watching the teacher. And then essentially what we were doing with the Peace Corps was looking to see what happened immediately after instruction. And then I was supposed to go to, this was a Nigerian group, I was supposed to go to Nigeria to follow them up. Unfortunately for everybody, the Biafran War broke out, and they wanted me to go, and I had a 7-month-old child, and I said, no way, I'm done, so. But my first money from any government agency was from the Peace Corps.
Peace Corps.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you got to UCLA as an assistant professor in 1968, and you're still there now. as a distinguished research professor.
Whatever,
of
yes,
education.
whatever title they happen to give.
And there's a lot that happened within there, including that you became in 1985, but you're still the co-director of the National Center for Research on Evaluation Standards.
Actually, there was a center before called the
okay.
Center for the Study of Evaluation.
Okay.
My predecessor was Marv Alkin, and then I took that on in 1975 by myself. And then I was the director of that. In the 1985, we bid again competitively, and Bob Lynn and I were co-directors of that, and we did that forever. And then Joan Herman ultimately joined us as a co-director. And then 2010, I decided I was going to retire. I had maxed out on the amount of money I could make in any retirement. And so UCLA has a deal, as every other place does, I think, where you can work 42 or 43% in addition, but no more. So since almost 9 years, I've been working in this research professor mode, which means only doing funded research. And I've worked, sadly, more days than the 2.5 that I've been paid for. I'm not quite as disciplined as I should be. And then in 2011, I became co-director with Lee Tsai, who's a psychometrician. And then in 2014, he became the director. And I sort of just did my own work.